and I talk about so many of them that we're often left being a little bit desensitized at the end of the day. But absolutely, there are really three key things that I want people to understand and take away from this incident. The number one thing is that we have to understand that, whenever you're going into an environment like this, any kind of crowded environment nowadays, any kind of environment, quite honestly, these kinds of attacks can happen. And to fall into the state of denial that says, well, there's nothing anyone can do, and it's like a lightning strike, and if it happens, and you're dead anyway, and nothing anyone can do about it, is a very fatalistic mentality. There's actually several things that we all can do. The first and foremost among them is accepting the reality for what it is and saying, okay, if I'm going to a concert, I'm going with my family to a large gathering, bad things can occur because there are wolves out there who want nothing more than to prey on the sheep as they see it. And the first thing you should realize is that whenever you get to an environment like that, pay attention to where your exits are, not just the one you came in from. Because if you're looking at the standpoint of most people, most attacks, most threats are coming in through the front door, so to speak. And the reason why is because that is the natural point of exit that most people are going to try and head to if they start to panic. And the reason why that happens is simply because most people haven't taken the time to sort of recognize where are there other exits. As an example, when we teach, we always tell people in these kinds of crowd situations, which is an area of focus for us when we're talking about international travel in particular, we talk about where there's always an exit beyond the stage, for example, and usually towards the left and right, sides of the stage. And the other component is to understand how to behave in the event that a panicked crowd starts to surge. One of the things that happens very often, Rob, as you just articulated very quickly, is that a lot of the injuries and the damage occurs after the attack when the crowd starts to panic. And what usually happens in these situations, Rob, is that when people get separated from their loved ones, that's what causes the real issues, because people try to spend time reuniting with their loved ones instead of sort of going with the flow. And you have to understand that a crowd that is surging like that is sort of like water, right? You have to almost go with it until it begins to dissipate before you can reunite with loved ones. So as a very, very simplistic but unfortunately necessary life skill in today's world is understanding when you are in a large crowded environment, if the crowd starts to move like that, even if you lose contact with your loved ones, which you want to try and maintain, but if you lose contact, go with the flow. Wait until it dissipates before trying to go against that flow to reconnect. Because when people try to go against the flow is when they get pushed to the ground, knocked down, trampled, etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Once you lose your footing, you are in a dire situation. The question is, if you can get out of the wave of people and find a safe place, maybe higher ground, a corner somewhere, out of the really, I think the masses that can be as deadly as any terrorist attack, because people aren't thinking clearly. They are thinking survival. It's all about flight and survival. So is that a good idea? You talked about going with the flow, but if you're hindsight and you have been trained or taught and you're able to keep your composure, and if you see some place to where you can go and protect yourself from this swarm of people, is that something you could possibly do?
Absolutely. So when you're looking at a crowded environment, one of the ways that we teach, we usually have a little PowerPoint slide that we put up where we show the basic construct of a crowd or a stage environment or something like that. If you really think about it, if you have a stage in front of you and you've got this large crowd, of people, where would you want to position yourself, Rob? If you were thinking tactically, understanding that, listen, you want to live in the world and you want to enjoy the concert, but where would you position yourself tactically for greatest safety? I'm asking you, Rob. What do you think?
Well, I think as far as near the closest exit sign and high above the crowd as I possibly can be, and with that exit sign in sight. I mean, that's what I would do. I mean, everybody always wants to be up close. I don't necessarily think that's such a good idea. Yeah,
I mean, I think definitely positioning yourself relatively close to an exit is fine. But, in terms of getting high ground, so to speak, what you want to think about is being on the edges, on the peripheries. You don't want to be in the middle of the crowd if you can avoid it. Now, of course, we buy tickets all the time to concerts and realize that our seats are right in the middle. I understand. Reality is reality. But if we had our choice, if we were going to see a large event or if we had to move with a crowd to exit a building or something like that, always try to move yourself towards the periphery, the sides of the press. And if you have that corner available or if you have a column that you can get behind, those are natural breaks. Again, thinking of it like moving water, you want to position yourself behind those natural barriers and shelters to avoid the press of the crowd. But the reality is we have to understand that when we're in a crowded environment, when you get jammed in like that and the crowd starts to surge, which can happen, the objective there is to keep contact with the people that you're with. But if contact is broken, which can very easily happen, everybody needs to be on the same page that you have to move with the flow. And it will dissipate. It will absolutely dissipate, usually in a fairly short amount of time, as soon as this sort of natural choke points start to open up. And the biggest danger is not being crushed on your feet. It's being knocked down, as you said. Once you lose your footing, you're in an extremely dire situation.
Listen, we are obviously talking about the aftermath of this tragedy in which 19 people are dead, 50 have been injured. But I think all of us have to accept the fact that terrorism could be around the corner. And it's more than likely you're going to be dealing with the aftermath as opposed to trying to stop it. And we've talked about that, if you've seen it happen, and what you should do if you're in a room or in an area where you notice something that is going on or has already happened. But when we come back, I want to talk about how you can really save yourself and someone that you love or care about, friend, family, in the way of self-defense from others who are trying to, exit a building and will do anything to save themselves, even if it is something physical. So we'll talk to Sam Rosenberg about that. He from Impacts, that's coming up in just a couple of moments. Again, this developing story, multiple explosions, Manchester, England, outside of an arena in which Ariana Grande was performing earlier tonight. And police in that part of the world are treating this as though it's an act of terrorism. CBS Radio News will have more at the top of the hour. And now I want to talk about what you do, Sam, if you have to fight someone off who just moments ago you were watching a concert and you were all buddy-buddy, and now each of you are trying to save your lives and your loved ones, and you'll do whatever, even if it means getting physical with that person who moments ago you were enjoying music together, and just a very wonderful evening now has turned very ugly. What do you think?
Well, I'm going to give you kind of a non-answer to that, Rob, because obviously a self-defense situation is a self-defense situation, but historically, and I've studied these kinds of things considerably over the last decade we're talking about disasters, whether they're airline disasters, whether they're natural disasters or man-made disasters like terrorist attacks, and why do people survive? Who survives and why? And one of the interesting dynamics there is that most people, in fact, are not violent or aggressive towards each other. The other victims on the scene are very rarely so. 9/11 was a perfect example. There was no pushing and shoving trying to get out of the towers, even though a plane had struck and the towers were on fire and one of the buildings collapsed next door. The idea is that people were still very, very, very almost, exceedingly polite to each other in helping each other move out of the buildings and get out quickly. Now, in a panicked crowd, you have a different dynamic because no one's thinking. And, in any disaster, you have a natural reduction of cognitive thought. But when people are in true panic mode and they're running for the hills, it's like the old Whitesnake concert back in the 90s where people were crushed against the doors that were locked, trying to get out of an arena that was on fire. Bad things do happen, but it's not typically a self-defense situation where someone's attacking you. It's literally you are trying to get out of the press, out of the environment that you're in that poses that danger. I'd actually like to talk about something actually just again on the aftermath dynamic, Rob, if you don't mind. There's one element that we didn't talk about here that I wanted to, which is that, listen, like every other situation we've ever discussed of a critical incident of any kind of terrorist act, one of the things we have to remember is that there are no lifeguards on the scene. right? There are no lifeguards, period. You've got to know how to swim. And one of the things we're talking about here is understanding that we, as the ordinary citizens, if we are on the scene of an incident like this, we are the first responders. And very often when there are traumatic injuries, whether people live or die is dependent on whether us, as ordinary citizens, know how to treat traumatic injuries. And this is a course that has been in development for 5 or 6 years now that we just started to roll out, which is something that takes the current battlefield technology and understanding of how to respond to traumatic injuries and teach people how to stop the bleeding so that folks can be saved. We've seen this again and again and again in critical incidents where folks are dying waiting for help to arrive. And whether they live or die is very often dependent on whether the people around them understand how to improvise a tourniquet or what their priorities are. Where people revert to doing CPR on people who have hemorrhagic wounds, right? And the reality is that there has to be a different priority set here. And unfortunately, this again is the world we are living in. It doesn't help to ignore it, and it doesn't help to rail against it. It helps to say, okay, until something happens, until some psychological shift occurs, or we win the war on terror, which is unlikely anytime soon, we have to understand that we as private citizens have greater responsibility to each other, not just to understand how to keep our friends and our family safe in a critical incident and ourselves safe, but also that in the aftermath, what to do to save lives in the event of a critical situation.
And here is something that I don't know. I think it's the cold hard facts, and you just said it, anytime soon. This is something that is now going to be a part of our lives for generations, and we have to learn to live within its world, and that is the world of terror. So everyone within the sound of our voice tonight, there is more than likely a good chance that they're going to face some sort of situation, if not in their lifetime, their children or grandchildren, because we know one thing: we've opened the Pandora's box, and getting it shut is almost, if not impossible, next to impossible.
I agree with you, Rob. I mean, this is, you can have two thoughts in your mind at the exact same time that seem contradictory. That, to me, I never lose my righteous indignation that I have to worry about my children every single time they go to school. Is it the last time I'm ever going to see them?
I know.
Right? It's a horrific situation that we are now facing. But at the same time, it doesn't help me or them or anyone else to just throw my hands in the air and say there's nothing we can do about it. We are simultaneously obligated to accept reality for what it is and learn how to manage it better. And that's all we're really talking about. It's not talking about being superheroes. We're not talking about anything. We're just learning how to get what are the life skills that we have to possess to survive in today's age. And one of the life skills, in my opinion, is how to protect yourself. So, situational awareness, training yourself to understand where your exits are and what you're going to do in the event of a situation. I'll give you a perfect example.
I got 1 minute. Go ahead.
Okay. Boston Marathon. The guy who helped the police identify the killers so quickly lost both of his legs. And the way that he was able to help them zero in on him was because when he came out of a 13-hour surgery in post-op pain, he says, I know who did it, and was able to describe to them to a T one of the killers because he saw him put his backpack down by the trash can and walk away from it. And in his mind, in his subconscious mind, as an intuition, he realized there was something very, very wrong about this situation. Now, had he gone and run to the police, nothing different would have happened. But my lesson from that was intuitively he knew something wasn't right. And what I always tell people about that story is, what could you do if you were in that situation and you know that you can't save everyone? At the minimum, you can put a building in between you and your family and that threat. So the idea is having a plan in mind of how you would handle these situations in advance is where we live nowadays. We don't rise to the occasion. We fall to the level of our training.
Sam Rosenberg, Impact. Sam, thank you. Good night.
Good night.